We made this.
Welcome everyone to a podcast all about the sounds of cinema and discussion about them between the notes, which is where we come in. I'm Tony Black.
And I'm Sean Wilson.
And this week we're bringing you discussion of music from Michael Giacchino, Simple Minds, Pino, Donaggio, Peter Gabriel and more as we discuss the music to high school movies as the students break up for summer in what has been easily the weirdest year of their education to date. So, because obviously for those for posterity, we're recording this in July of 2020 when the coronavirus outbreak isn't like we're not in lockdown really anymore, really, although some people might be, but it's sort of out there, but everyone's trying to pretend it's not. So it's a really strange time for the students to break up for what would normally be, a summer of partying and going out with your friends and doing all that. This summer, it's going to be a little bit more like, do we go out there? Do we do anything? It's going to be a weird one, isn't it?
Yeah, apprehensive is probably I say apprehensive. I'm not 15 years old. I feel apprehensive and I'm not at school anymore. So I just, I've been thinking actually, I think me and you were very, very blessed to get through probably the entirety of our school and university years without any of this kind of disruption. I feel so bad for all of the kids at the moment having to deal with all this, particularly the kids that are about to go to uni. I think, my goodness me, what has this done for their prospects? What's this done for their academic year? Added to that, all the usual stresses and strains. But we're here to be optimistic, right? We're here to champion great music, as that diverse lineup that you introduced indicates.
Yeah, and there are ups and downs. I mean, I work with students, particularly like sixth form students, and they've coped. Considering, I mean, you hear a lot in the press about how it's terrible. They're having terrible time. They've coped quite well, most of them, actually. I think. Pretty much, they're a much more resilient age group than people give them credit for, actually. So I think a lot of them will be cautious, but they'll go out and they'll have fun, and I think they will try and embrace a summer where they're going to be a bit more anxious than normal because they don't really know what they're going to go back into in September when all the schools fully open and we go back to quote unquote normal, if there is such a thing anymore. And university students, going off to a lot of distance learning and stuff, but they hopefully will be able to enjoy it. And that's why we were a bit like, well, we had the quite sad episode last week about Ennio Morricone's passing, and we've done some, serious sort of, I'm Christopher Nolan stuff. So we thought, let's mix it up and have a bit of fun with high school movies, which are a nice blend of orchestral music, the kind of things we normally, is our bread and butter on this podcast, but also have particular pop songs or rock songs or tunes that have cascaded through the decades and aren't just necessarily one kind of style. There's a real broadness to high school movies.
Yeah, I think what we're going to talk about is the evolution of high school movies and also how the music has evolved as well. And yet there is that underlying principle of, rebelliousness, independence, coming of age, the idea that you're not quite a kid, but you're not quite an adult either. And how does music reflect that? I was actually really looking forward to doing this one because I think it's a lovely change up to actually include pop songs and rock songs in it. Because like you said, we don't do that very often. And yeah, I was just looking down through the list and I was just smiling at the diversity of it and the diversity of the soundtracks. And I think that for me, obviously, we've talked about the art of original film composition. That, like you say, that's our bread and butter. But the art of constructing a soundtrack that is composed of other people's music, that's an art form in and of itself. It's a real skill to collate a host of songs and package them together in a cinematic presentation that communicates the narrative of the film. I think that is an art. That is worth championing in and of itself. I mean, I think someone who does that brilliantly is Quentin Tarantino. Obviously, Quentin Tarantino hasn't done a high school movie. Actually, I'd quite like to see that. Quentin Tarantino doing a high school movie. That would be very interesting. I wonder what music he would pick. But the act of what he does is because he's got such an encyclopedic knowledge of pop music and surf music and rock music, he intuitively picks exactly the right songs for the given scenes, and then when you listen to the album presentation away from the film, everything coheres so magnificently. There's a real narrative flow to it, and there's such joy to listen to. And I think that the examples we've picked today also have that kind of narrative flow as well. You get a sense of the journey of the characters through the music, which is wonderful.
Yeah, and it's been a real pleasure to sort of enjoy this playlist actually that we've put together, because we've got 10 tracks. We're not going for albums, we're going for tracks from a range of different films, ranging as far back as like the 1950s, through to the 1970s, the 1980s, and into the modern day, really. So we're covering quite a broad period of films that all sort of rest under a similar banner, even if they have different approaches, different shades to them, different genres to them, really. So it's quite an eclectic mix, I think, we've got. And I suppose before we start, thinking in terms of high school movies, I mean, when you think, what do people conjure up in their mind when they think of a high school movie, I suppose? I mean, for me, I immediately think Breakfast Club, 1980s, John Hughes, kind of, American high school scenario. I think, even though I wasn't at high school in that era, and I know you weren't, Sean. We were, going to school in the 90s and stuff like that, and into the early noughties and that kind of thing. But there was still, in terms of culture, in terms of popular culture, that image that you've seen even now in TV shows like Sex Education, in the modern day, where they expressly sort of tap into that John Hughes style of colourful high school fun and just youthfulness and rebellion and all those kind of things. I mean, is there a particular image to that, and is that reflected in the soundtracks of these films?
Yeah, I think that. Well, I think we are very, very, very exposed to American pop culture images of high school in this country, in the UK. I think you're right about that. I think that, whenever I think of the phrase high school, to me means America. High school, I mean, I know there are places in Britain that do use it, but to me, Britain is like primary school, secondary school, sixth form, university, whereas high school itself is a very American term. So as soon as I hear that, I think of, well, my mind automatically goes back again. John Hughes, yeah, it goes back further, probably to the likes of like James Dean and people like that. The idea of, I think what we're going to talk about on this is the idea of when the concept of the teenager was maybe popularised or even created for the first time in movie form. And I think that has cast a very, very seductive, almost romanticised air throughout cinema, probably from like the early 1950s onwards. And certainly I think the contrast between the presentation of schools in America and the presentation of schools here is very different. In America, there is that again, that the word is that there is that romanticized air of massive long corridors with lockers, with people kind of joshing and like cliques and things like that. I mean, you do get that to an extent in the UK, but I don't think it's either not as pronounced in the UK or it's not quite the way that the American movies depict it. But I think certainly when you cement an image like that in the minds of an audience, it's very hard to shake off. I mean, I think of, my high school years as fairly banal and fairly mundane. I mean, certainly there weren't anything like as interesting as any of the movies we're gonna pick today. But I think music is one of the things that creates association with your school years. I think that's really, really important. I mean, I remember when I finished school in 2005, so like late mid to late noughties, I finished school and I went to university. That was basically the indie rock, alt rock boom. So Killers, Muse, Gorillaz, things like that. And I think that no matter what one's interpretation of high school, you'll always associate those years with music, with how music got you through it. And I think that each of these films that we've selected demonstrates how music can communicate with a teenage audience, with that idea of rebellion, and how does music help you express yourself and so on.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's, like I say, there's a varied amount of different styles and films here that hopefully means we'll cover a bit of a spectrum, which will be, and we can illuminate different facets of, you know, the high school movie experience. So I'll kick us off with I suppose a more traditional sort of choice for Between the Notes. The title track, the title credits from Ladybird, the Greta Gerwig film that came out a couple of years ago, scored by John Brion, or Brion, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name actually, whether there's an emphasis on the I, who has got quite an eclectic sort of background, film composer, but also somebody who's produced music for people like Kanye West, Fiona Apple, Amy Mann, various different, you know, musicians. But he's also tethered, certainly early on, quite heavily with Paul Thomas Anderson in some of those earlier films, contributing to like Boogie Nights and scoring films like Magnolia and stuff like that. I think that Ladybird is Ladybird's a really good film about high school experience, starring Saoirse Ronan as the eponymous Ladybird, and it's a good film. But I always really like the music to this. As soon as I saw the film, because it has a kind of chirpiness to it, particularly this title track that sort of introduces everything, and has something I think sort of lays down it's definitely one of those soundtracks and those scores that lays down a mood, I think, to a film like Ladybird. It sort of establishes that there is a precociousness about the character herself, and it definitely adds something to the picture.
Yeah, it does. I think prickliness is how I describe it. It's prickly, but in an entertaining way. That I think is the tone of the music, and that's by intention, because Saoirse Ronan's wonderful central performance, for which she was Oscar nominated. She is someone who is, is on the cusp of wanting to go to university on the East Coast. She wants to get out of Sacramento. It's 2002, so it's pre-social media. So that made me identify with the film immediately, because I kind of thought, well, I was in school around that point, and that really resonated with me. The idea of people don't have mobile phones, or if they do have mobile phones, it's not very pronounced. And, you know, the musical choices in the background, I think Justin Timberlake is heard at one point, and I think, okay, that creates an identification with me. But yeah, the John Bryan's score is great. I looked up, there was a Vanity Fair article that I looked up while I was preparing for this recording, and apparently he was inspired by his high school band days to create a score that didn't have any strings in it but emphasised the woodwind ensemble, because he always said he liked woodwind ensembles, and he says that strings are often used as a crutch in orchestral scores to create a kind of crass emotional response, and he didn't want to do that. So I think that tone immediately makes the Ladybird score stand out as something quirky and unique. You remove the strings out of it, you emphasise the woodwinds. There is also that, you'll know that there's that recurrent like piano motif, which Greta Gerwig and John Bryan describe it as Ferris is the falling up, falling down theme, which is the motif for Ladybird herself, as she's kind of ambling along, arguing with her mother, brilliantly played by Laurie Metcalf, who was Oscar nominated as well. I mean, the scenes between the two, her and Saoirse Ronan, are great. They are so resonant and so realistic. I think a lot of, obviously, the credit for that needs to go to Greta Gerwig as well, for her brilliant writing and directing. I think it's got the score has got a tone to it that is melancholy. The idea that you want to embrace adulthood, yet you're not quite in a position to be able to do so fully. There is an air of rebelliousness and chippiness about the rhythms of the score, which very much ties into it. Given, like you said, John Bryan's background, there's definitely a kind of like pop sensibility, I think, underscoring the rhythmic choices. Yeah, John Bryan is a wonderful, he's very underrated, and he did that Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind as well. He's got a very signature sound, and I think he's perfect. He's perfect for this film, just in terms of it. I mean, it's a complex film to score, because you're dealing with, in a sense, you are dealing with archetypes. You are dealing with the post-high school teenager who is about to make the big jump to college, and yet it's very relatable and it's very universal, and the presentation of the movie is very realistic. It's not done necessarily in a stylized, fantastical way. So it's kind of like, well, how do I give inner voice to that character played by Saoirse Ronan? And I think John Brion does it brilliantly.
Yeah, I agree. I think it helps sell the character, actually. I think it helps because she, like you say, she is quite prickly, and she at first might appear hard to warm to, but by the end you really are carried along with her trials and tribulations in terms of her wanting to be. It's sort of almost a recurring theme in some of Saoirse Ronan's sort of parts. This kind of, you know, sort of almost standoffish, very quite precocious, determined young woman. She plays a similar sort of character in Little Women in a way, who wants to, you know, make her way in the world. And I think it sometimes, and her performance is great, and it sometimes takes, you know, a musical sort of accompaniment to sell a character like that. Because you do get characters like that in these kind of high school movies. You know, you get characters who are at first people who, I mean, I suppose a different kind of example would be Alicia Silverstone in Clueless, who at first is like, you know, high school bitch in inverted commas, but she's not ultimately, and you start to see the different sides to her character. So I think it's interesting how, and you know, maybe it could be seen as a negative in that you have quite a lot of high school movies, maybe ones that are particularly set around a female or a female cast that initially are harder to warm to than maybe the sort of more jocular, blokey kind of high school movies. That is possibly a bit of a failing. In fact, I was reading the I don't know if you read the book, the Brian Raftery book about 1999 best movie ever.
No.
Really good book, came out last year, I think. And there's a piece on American Pie about how, you know, American Pie actually it has some questionable use of females in that film now. When you look back, there's a bit problematic, but also at the same time, you could quite easily flip that whole concept around to be much more angled along, you know, female lines in terms of control and that kind of thing of what they're doing, you know, and agency. And it would only take a slight little pivot. So I just find that kind of thing interesting. Does the high school movie sort of prejudice women in a way? Yeah.
Do you mean does it generally favour men? Or I think it definitely has done. I think definitely the past. Though one could say that. Well, I mean, John Hughes was always very, very balanced. I don't want to preempt what we're going to say about John Hughes, but I think he considered Molly Ringwald his muse, and he always put her front and centre. Well, in several movies, he put her front and centre. So yeah, it's an interesting thing. I mean, I suppose that might be a wider conversation about, well, in recent years, you've had comedies that have foregrounded ensembles of women. You think of Bridesmaids or Girls Trip, you know, those I think in a way have been designed as a riposte to the kind of idiotic likes of The Hangover, which I hate. But I suppose that's probably a wider philosophical conversation. I mean, one of the things I like about Lady Bird is that it doesn't soften Saoirse Ronan's character. It doesn't sentimentalise her at all. She's a fantastic actor anyway, really good. I mean, one of the things that I did want to bring up was the fact that there's a great scene in which they talk about the Dave Matthews Band, the song Crash Into Me, and it's kind of like, she's like, you don't like the Dave Matthews Band? And again, that whole idea of, you know, very often an uncommunicative, stroppy teenager, you'll elicit a reaction out of them via the power of music, which is it's a kind of binding, redemptive thing, and I think we're going to find that with the rest of the films that we're going to talk about. Also, I should say that this film co-stars Beanie Feldstein in a scene-stealing performance, and we'll be talking about Beanie Feldstein later on as well in another film.
Yeah, big hint there as to what that's going to be later. Yeah, she's really good, to be fair. But let's wind the clock back then, because you've gone for something probably the furthest back, actually, that we'll go in this podcast. You've gone for a classic 50s rock tune, Rock Around the Clock, by Bill Haley and the Comets.
Yeah, it's for the film Blackboard Jungle, not composed specifically for the film Blackboard Jungle. It was used in the film. I hadn't watched this film before preparation for this podcast, and I remember it being constantly cited at university by one of my lecturers about how it's one of the archetypal teenage high school movies, if not the archetypal one, from 1955. It cemented or invented a lot of the cliches that we now take for granted in terms of the high school movie. And I watched it, and I have to say I was really impressed. It's very, very good. It's directed by Richard Brooks. It stars Glenn Ford as a former, I believe he's a Navy veteran or a war veteran who comes to serve at a very tough inner city school in which delinquency is at its peak. The students are like violent, they are ill-disciplined, and he bonds with a young black student played by Sidney Poitier in his film debut, I believe. Sidney Poitier is terrific, who is playing a student who is musically very gifted and yet maybe is subject to peer pressure from some of his more troubled contemporaries. It's a really good film. It's really edgy, quite very dark. There is early on which I was kind of taken aback. I now understand why this film is considered so culturally significant, because it is very much back in 1950s. One had to understand the concept of the teenager, at least on the big screen, was a new thing. It had only just started to come out via the likes of James Dean, and the idea of teenage delinquency was a relatively new cinematic phenomenon in the 1950s, and this film does really grab the bull by the horns. There are scenes of assault and violence upon adult figures, which are actually quite shocking for the time. And I thought, well, fair play to director Richard Brooks. I mean, one could say now that it's relatively crude and maybe it doesn't get underneath the skin of the issue. But then you have to think this film was an outlier in this subject matter. It kind of put it out there, and it takes a rigorously objective, non-sentimental look at how tough it is in certain inner city school environments. There's a character played by Vic Morrow who is really quite repulsive. I mean, there is a reason why he behaves like he does, but then, and again, it's that whole idea of why is it that certain kids behave in that way. And again, considering this was from 1955, is incredibly forward thinking. And the other, one of the things that I remember my lecturers bringing up at university was the use of Rock Around the Clock, as you said, by Bill Haley and his Comets. Which is used in the opening credits and the closing credits of the film, and it's used to create an identification with what was a then burgeoning teenage audience. Like the Hollywood politics was changing, pop culture was changing. It was necessary to reach out to the youth audience, and one of the ways this film did this was with the song Rock Around the Clock, which is interesting because it was apparently written for Bill Haley, but he didn't record it at first. It was recorded by an Italian-American band and then he later recorded it in 1954. Apparently the song wasn't actually a particular success at first, but when they attached it to the film, it shot through the roof and it became the rock and roll classic that it now is. I mean, I think you'd be hard pushed to find anyone who hadn't heard this before, right? It's pretty well known, isn't it? I mean, you just have to play a few bars of it. So the song wasn't initially a success, but when they applied it to the movie, it shot through the roof. And I think this is Rock Around the Clock is one of those songs I think pretty much everyone's heard, right? It's so famous. Even if you're not into early 50s rock and roll, or if you're not into rock and roll at all, you'll have heard this somewhere along the line. And Blackboard Jungle is the movie that kind of cemented it in the minds of people. Interesting behind the scenes story. Reports suggest that it was Glenn Ford's son, Peter, who he had it in his record collection, and apparently they went through it and they selected it from there. Apparently that's what reports say. And yeah, I mean, it's definitely got that youth rebellion feel about it. Again, even though it's only used at the start and at the end of the film, it kind of captures the tone of the film very well. I mean, music is an important theme throughout the story. There is quite an upsetting anguish scene in which another teacher who is less tough than Glenn Ford's character makes the mistake of bringing in his jazz records into the classroom in an attempt to to show the kind of redemptive binding element of music, as we mentioned earlier with Ladybird. And of course, it descends into absolute anarchy, and his records are destroyed, which basically pushes him over the edge. And that's quite a tough scene to watch. And again, it's very gritty. It's very pretty like full on in terms of the aggression that's shown towards authority figures. I think in the end, what it does show is that music can have a healing quality as well. I mean, have you seen this film? I
haven't seen the film. No, I had heard of it, I think, but I've obviously heard the song many times, and it's a classic. I mean, 50s, that kind of 50s, teen rock is just brilliant. There's so much at that point that was coming out that's just amazing, and it sort of reflects that sense of teenage, the change in the teenage mindset that sort of kicks off in the 50s. It's a great song. I was interested as well how, and this was something I discovered on Spotify when I was putting the playlist together. There is actually an orchestral sort of cover of it or version of it for the film by a composer called Charles Walcott and the MGM Studio Orchestra, and it's good. It's a good version of Rock Around the Clock, and there's also like a love theme from the film as well by the same composer, which it has a sort of jazzy, sort of dusky feel to it as well, which I sort of feel fits with quite a bit of sort of old sort of style band going on at the same time. But it has it fits the era, and I guess it fits the kind of film and the kind of tone you're talking about actually around that point. But I've added those onto the Spotify playlist we've got because they're a nice little addition to the actual, belting Bill Haley song. So yeah, it's a good choice. And it's not necessarily one that everyone would think of either. The immediate go-tos, and we're going to talk about an immediate go-to in a second, but it's a good one. It's a famous song, but a less famous film. So hopefully it'll encourage people to check it out.
I mean, I suppose the one thing actually that you raised a good point there, the idea of the collision between kind of jazz staples and rock and roll mirrors the themes of the film. The idea of the new youth movement versus the old traditional, apparently conservative values, that collision is there between the characters and within the music itself, which is another interesting dramatic device.
So for my second one, I've gone for what is basically a 1980s classic in Don't You Forget About Me by Simple Minds for John Hughes' The Breakfast Club, which we've talked about a couple of times already. This is came out in originally came out in the US in 1985, and then it appears on The Breakfast Club, which came out just around the same time, actually, just a couple of weeks beforehand. So it sort of came into the minds of Simple Minds, who were a Scottish rock band of the era, for The Breakfast Club. The composers of The Breakfast Club were fans of the band Simple Minds, and they wrote the song for the band in mind. But I think it was passed around a couple of different people first before they got into it, because they were a bit worried about it not being their own material that they were recording, Simple Minds. So I think it was sent to like Brian Ferry and Billy Idol, but they said no at the time. But eventually I think they caught on that it was a really good song. And after some convincing, they moved from their original position, which was, we are Simple Minds. We don't do songs that sound like Simple Minds. We are Simple Minds. We do our own songs. But eventually, it got through, and they eventually recorded this for The Breakfast Club, which I mean is great, because I don't feel like this is one of those songs that's so sort of tethered to that film, but also doesn't feel like... I mean, it's easy to say this statement in hindsight, because we never know what other versions are going to be like, but it is one of those songs that you can't imagine sounding any differently through another singer. And yes, there might be a parallel universe where we have the Billy Idol version of Simple Minds on The Breakfast Club, but I don't know. I just feel like it fits. It all just sort of comes together to make probably one of the most iconic, particularly iconic songs tethered to a movie that maybe there's ever been.
It's astonishing, isn't it? It fits the film like a glove. It really does. And I think it's amazing. When I was just looking up just a little bit of backstory on this. Apparently, Bill Kerr didn't have any faith in the song at all when they recorded it. Apparently, they recorded it in 3 hours in North London and kind of then thought, right, that's it. You know, it's going to be a throwaway, forgettable, trashy song for a forgettable, throwaway, trashy film. How wrong they were. Astonishingly wrong. I think I watched the film again very recently as part of my preparation for this recording, and I was struck actually how well the song works as a dramatic device, because you hear the song over the opening credits before you're even introduced to the characters. You hear the tone of the Simple Minds, and the tone is such an important thing. Like the fact that the song has got a wistful melancholy quality to it. I think it's got a kind of subdued anger to it, but it's also got an inspiration edge. It's a fantastic song. I mean, I think the song needs to be reclaimed on its own away from the film, because as a piece of composition, the song is actually really good on its own terms. It's really great. And I think sometimes what happens with these like pop hits is that they become so identified with the movie that you can't appreciate them on their own terms. But obviously we're here to talk about it narratively within the film, and I think but John Hughes opening the film with the opening credits with that song, what he's telling us is, right, you know what the tone of this film is going to be before you've even met the characters, before you've even seen them. And then that then comes full circle at the end, because the song then plays out during the final scene and into the end credits. So it anticipates what the tone is going to be, and it kind of confirms the tone at the end. It's very well utilized. Again, we've talked about music editing and music spotting a lot on this podcast. The placement of music within a film, be it a piece of original score or a pre-existing song, that's so important. And I think that, yeah, it so singularly gets the complicated tone of the movie, because having watched the movie again, the movie is not the what I remember it as is the cheesy, exuberant, you know, epitome of the 80s dancing on a table movie. I mean, there are scenes like that, but it's a much darker movie than I remember it being. It's a much angrier movie. The fact that you have these disparate characters, the jock, the prom queen, the outcast, the bully, the nerd, all congregate together in detention, and they are all variously unhappy. They are all grappling with various abusive families, guilty secrets, anxieties, paranoias, and that all comes out during that confession scene 3/4 of the way through, which apparently I was astonished to learn, I read into this, was mostly improvised. And I'm like, blimey, that's good acting. That's really good acting if that's improvised. And it's very angry. There's a lot of rage. There's a lot of despair in the film, in addition to the humorous moments, of which there are many. And I think that the film's reputation deserves, I think, reanalysis on that basis, because everyone remembers the kind of marijuana-fueled dance on the table, the synchronized dance on the table and everything like that. But there is real darkness in the film. It's interesting. It's a flip side to the more joyous, freewheeling Ferris Bueller's Day Off, which I prefer. I think Ferris Bueller's Day Off is a much better film. I think mainly for that reason, that it's just that film is just so fun and so jubilant. But it is remarkable how, when you get to that end scene in the Breakfast Club, how well the Simple Minds song affirms what it is that you've just watched. The fact that the lyrics seem to be talking about, you know, the lyrics almost seem to be talking about a quest for identity and a quest for acceptance, which is what each of the characters want. The likes of Judd Nelson, Emilio Estevez, Anthony Michael Hall, Ali Sheedy, Molly Ringwald, you know, they're grappling with this kind of existential philosophical crisis. They're at this juncture in their lives in terms of what do they do with their own identity, what do they do in terms of their interpersonal relationships with each other. What do they do in relation to their principal, brilliantly played by Paul Gleason? Yeah, I think, having watched the film again, I was really struck by just how brilliantly that Don't You Forget About Me works.
Yeah, it really does. I mean, it's a great song anyway. And The Breakfast Club is like the archetypal high school movie in many ways. You know, I mean, it's inspired so many things for decades now. And like you're right in that the song deserves to, you know, be appreciated on its own terms, but yeah, it's a great aspect to, yeah, a really, really fun very sort of signature 1980s high school movie. You've gone for something slightly different for your second choice, though. We've gone back into the realms of scored music once again for a webbed surveillance from Spider-Man Homecoming by Michael Giacchino.
Yeah, it's because the reason why I picked this was because Spider-Man Homecoming was basically described as John Hughes meets a superhero movie, and that's fairly accurate. And I think that one of the key, that was the kind of key USP, wasn't it? When this film came out in 2017, it was the solo movie debut of Tom Holland's Peter Parker Spider-Man. He had appeared in Captain America Civil War, but that was kind of a cameo appearance. This was the first time Tom Holland had led a Marvel comic book property on his own, and it was really great. And I think it did have a decidedly more whimsical tone, at least in its early stretches. And I think one of the reasons for that is because, whereas previously Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield were trying to pass themselves off as teenagers, they were both terrific as Spider-Man, but you kind of looked at them and there was that kind of barriers, kind of, I don't quite buy into you as a high school teenager. Whereas you look at Tom Holland, who is, youthful and puppyish, and you think, well, all right, I buy into that. And I think the high school scenes therefore have more conviction. There's obviously the scenes with Ned, played by Jacob Batalon, with them bantering together, and there's that brilliant moment where Ned discovers that he is Spider-Man, and then he keeps on like imposing, like asking him questions like, "Can you do this? Can you do that?" which is very funny. Yeah, and I think John Watts, he observes that environment very well, and clearly it's Ferris Bueller with webs in it. That's clearly what they were going for, and I think that approach definitely means that Giacchino's score is perhaps lighter on its feet than maybe what Danny Elfman and James Horner did with the preceding Spider-Man films. I think that you have a lot of emphasis on sort of pizzicato plucked strings and almost a kind of like funky like jazz element, lots of bongos, lots of movement. There's lots of like skittering, scampering movement, particularly during the high school sequences where it's like, all right, okay, this is definitely approximating, the tone of a spider scampering around or someone, quickly scaling a rooftop. It's got that lovely kind of harmonic rhythmic movement to it. Obviously, it being within the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it is part of a wider chronology, and there has to be a kind of dramatic impetus as well, that the story has to move into dangerous, deadly territory, which obviously happens with the Michael Keaton character, Adrian Toomes, or Vulture. And there is a villain's theme that has kind of got an imposing brass element to it that weaves around the Peter Parker Spider-Man theme. In fact, one of the reasons why I chose this track, Web Surveillance, is because that dance between those two themes is demonstrated really, really well in this track. People can go and obviously listen to the piece on our Spotify playlist, but the battle between the light scampering Spider-Man theme and the crushing, doom-laden Vulture theme, which becomes more and more apparent as the score goes on. The score gets darker and more dramatic as it goes on, is, I think, really well done. I don't think it quite the score for me doesn't quite have the emotional resonance of maybe what Danny Elfman and James Horner did with it, but it's great fun. I mean, obviously, one has to draw attention to the fact that they used the original Spider-Man TV series theme during the opening logo music, which is really, really good. When I interviewed Michael Giacchino a few years ago, he's a lovely, lovely person. So enthusiastic. I mean, he's perfect to score a character like Peter Parker, who is so full of enthusiasm and energy, because Michael Giacchino is like that as well. He is basically like, he's like, Michael Giacchino is like a 13-year-old kid who's been given a conductor's baton to basically do what he wants to do. He's followed his dream of becoming a film composer, and he said to me, he has been able to realise that dream of leading an orchestra for films, because he told me, like, when he was 13 years old, he was obsessed with listening to the likes of Star Wars and things on records, and he's managed to realise that. And the use of the Spider-Man TV theme in the opening came out of a conversation that he'd had with Kevin Feige, the Marvel president, and Kevin Feige kind of threw the idea at him, or he threw the idea at Kevin Feige. You can go and look at my interview on Den of Geek if you're so inclined with Michael. And
we'll put it in the show notes.
Cool. Yeah, we can do that. And they came up with a version of it for the Hall H crowd at Comic-Con 2016, I think it was, and the crowd went absolutely wild for it. and they thought, well, that worked, let's rework it and put it at the start of the film. It was a lovely little anecdote there. But yeah, I think if John Hughes had made a superhero movie, if John Hughes was still alive, bless him, to make a superhero movie, I think this is probably what the score would have sounded like. And
I think in many ways it's what the film would have looked like, to be honest. Definitely. I think absolutely they're in step. I mean, I'm a huge Giacchino fan, and we've talked about him before on this podcast, but I think he's the greatest composer of his age working today in terms of what he does. And every single franchise he manages to score, he puts his own distinctive slant on, and he did the same with Spider-Man here. And Far From Home, the next film, is equally really good in terms of the score, and hopefully if he does the third Tom Holland Spider-Man film, which I'm sure he will, it'll be similar story really. But yeah, it's a really good track on a cracking album for a really good film. So it's a win all round really. I'm going to go back for my third, back into the 80s, to probably, we've mentioned it a couple of times before, probably the other signature teenage high school film in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, starring Matthew Broderick as the eponymous Bueller. Anyone?
Bueller. Fry.
Anyone?
Fry.
No. And it's a really great romp of a film. Like you said, it's a different type of high school movie to The Breakfast Club, but it sort of goes in a different direction. But and particularly the song I've chosen is Danke from that film, which is the song that various characters in the film sing at many points. A song which goes back to the early 50s and 60s, particularly when an American singer called Wayne Newton sang it in 1963, an American version of it, because it goes back originally to a German composer called Bert Kaempfert, I think is how you say his name. And Wayne Newton's track was particularly well known at the time, but John Hughes hated it. So obviously John Hughes does this as well as The Breakfast Club, and he said it was the most awful song of my youth. Every time it came on, I just wanted to scream, claw my face. I was taking German in high school, which meant that we listened to it in school. I couldn't get away from it. But according to Matthew Broderick, it was his idea to sing it in the shower in that, because he says, although it's only because of the brilliance of John deciding that I should sing Dankeschön on the float in the parade, I had never heard the song before. I was learning it for the parade scene. So we're doing the shower scene, and I thought, well, I can do a little rehearsal. And I did something with my hair to make that mohawk. And you know what good directors do? They say, stop, wait until we roll. And John put that stuff in. So it sort of carries on throughout the film. And it's a strange song, but it fits the tone, I think, of Ferris Bueller in a way. It's a different style. It's a very different kind of song to Simple Minds in terms of I suppose The Breakfast Club was a bit, in its own way, a bit cooler, or trying to be a bit cooler with the kind of high school sort of setup and these sort of rebellious sort of characters. Whereas Ferris Bueller is more impish. It's more of a film where you've got this guy who just decides to goof off and go on a wild day and stealing cars and all this kind of thing, but in a fun sense. So I suppose it reflects a film that has a more mischievousness to it.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think I have to say outright, Ferris Bueller's Day Off is one of my favourite feel-good movies of all time. I think it's brilliant. It's so much fun to watch, and I do prefer it to The Breakfast Club. I think it's John Hughes' best film, and I think the reason for that is because the scenario of the film is so elemental. Everyone either bunked off school or wanted to bunk off school at some point. Everyone wanted to go and have an adventure, even if it was just literally walking, I don't know, like walking to the McDonald's down the road when you weren't supposed to, which is kind of how exciting
that's life in Devon.
It really is. That's how exciting it got for me. And then you imagine my reaction when I watched Ferris Bueller's Day. I thought, blimey, my high school years were boring. Although obviously we are dealing with a work of fantasy, with a work of fiction here. But the emotional principle of that, of bunking off school, is so universal and so relatable that the movie becomes such a joy to watch. And you're right, it is impish, is exactly what it's got. More of a fantastical, freewheeling, almost more surreal feeling than The Breakfast Club. which to an extent was more grounded and more claustrophobic, and it was like a single, a very limited group of characters, whereas this, through the music as well, it throws out a variety of different tones. The Wayne Newton is very kitsch, I think is the words, but it's kitsch it's presented in a knowingly ironic way. I mean, it's a very, very ironic film. I mean, you got Matthew Broderick breaking the fourth wall all the way through the movie. Like he's making us complicit in his adventures, which makes the movie more fun. We are kind of there with him because he's addressing us. And the soundtrack, as a result, strikes a much greater variety of tones than I think the one for the Breakfast Club does. I mean, at one point you've got where his friend Cameron or Alan Ruck, they take his dad's Ferrari and they put it in the garage, and of course the guys looking after the garage are going to hijack the car and drive it around Chicago. And you got that bit where they queue up John Williams's opening piece from Star Wars: A New Hope, the Rebel blockade runner. Which syncs up to a scene of the Ferrari flying across the top of the camera in slow motion as these guys have nicked this priceless car, which is just a wonderful, fantastical pop culture moment. It's designed to kind of lift you out of the film. You think, oh, all right, okay, that's the thing from Star Wars, one of the most famous bits of music ever, but it works. And you have the Oh Yeah by Yellow, Oh Yeah, chicka chicka. Like that. The scene where Rooney, the principal, having been roundly humiliated throughout the whole film to hilarious degrees, suffers the ignominy of having to get on the school bus with the rest of the students and sit down. And it's like, oh yeah. It's like, and it's wonderful. It shows again how one's teenage years very often strike a manner of surreal, fantastical notes, even though you might not realise it at the time. Looking back at it in hindsight, you think, oh god, yeah, that moment in high school was quite weird. And I think John Hughes sees that. Clearly, the film is an act of John Hughes. Looking back on his own teenage years to an extent, I think there is definitely that nostalgic quality to it. But the way he amps up the weirdness and the oddness of Ferris and Cameron's adventures is very well reflected in the music. It's a very diverse soundtrack. And we have to mention the use of the Beatles cover of Twist and Shout, which follows the Danke moment on the parade. I mean, the Twist and Shout scene is just one of the greatest feel-good moments of any film ever, where the streets of Chicago are literally filled with people who get in on the act and start dancing. It's brilliant because it's not dealing with that social realist context that the Breakfast Club was dealing with. It's dealing with something much more jubilant and not necessarily kind of grounded in the reality that one might expect, but it works. It works for the emotional journey of Ferris. I think I love this film and I love this soundtrack to bits.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's very, very playful and enjoyable, and it's a really good film. You're going back a decade for your next choice, Sean, to an equally classic film. You've chosen You're the One I Want. You are the one I want. So that was really tone deaf on my part. I can't sing.
That
was tone deaf on the part of me singing it. But, by the cast of Grease, which is probably outside of the Breakfast Club. He probably is even more famous than The Breakfast Club, really, in terms of a high school movie. But I think it does. He obviously, but in virtue of being a musical, it's a different bag, isn't it?
Yeah. I think you're right. Yeah, I think when a lot of Brits think of high school, they think of Grease, don't they? Absolutely think of Grease, and I think it's not. It's probably. I mean, in a way, like we said with The Breakfast Club, the reputation of the music sometimes. It might seem like a bit of an odd thing to say, given how famous Grease is, but I think the reputation of the music itself could be done with being salvaged a little bit, because goodness knows, when I was a teenager, I was inflicted with that Grease mega mix in club nights, pretty much.
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
It's still going.
It's still going.
Every time I went out, I would invariably end up in some sort of 80s club, because that's just how me and my friends rolled. And almost every week for probably about 5 years in my 20s, I was boogieing to this at 1 a.m. Like, yeah, just it has sort of been overshadowed by the fact now it's become. Well, let's put it this way: there's probably a whole generation of young people who know these songs and have never watched Grease.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I think if that is the case, that's a shame, because the film is still terrific. The film still stands. I mean, we discussed this before we started recording. There are some questionable elements which haven't dated that well, but for the most part, the attention to detail in the music, in the choreography, in the physical nuance of the performances is really charming and really funny. And obviously, John Travolta and Olivia Newton-John have terrific chemistry, but the songs stand up to an astonishing degree. And I think it's easy to mistakenly make the assumption that coming up with a memorable melody or rhythm is easy. I don't think that's easy at all. I mean, you can stitch a bunch of notes together to craft something that's musical. Whether people are going to remember that or not, who knows? If you've made something, a piece of music that people remember, it's clearly worked on some level. It's clearly resonated, and I mean, pretty much all the songs from Grease are amazing. I mean, I've gone for You're the One That I Want, which I think the reason why I picked this was because narratively it's probably one of the most significant. You have the idea of Danny Zuko, John Travolta, the greaser who has had to undergo something of a character change in order to win back the heart of Sandy, Olivia Newton-John, who, they had a summer romance. She went back to Australia and she's now come back. And then she undergoes her own change at the end, appearing in the full, like leather getup. And I think that what the song does in a very cheeky, knowingly ironic way, because obviously it's a 70s film, but it's riffing on the era of the Blackboard Jungle. It's set in the 50s, so it's meant to be riffing on the idea of greasers and high school beauty queens and things like that. But the Battle of the Sexes in this song, I think, is actually, it's really well done through the music and the choreography. The sort of like the give and take between John Travolta and Olivia Newton-John is very charming. Just the way that they interact with each other, like the way that one person will follow the other person will spin around and then push the other one away. That tussle is really great, and obviously harmonically together there. I mean, it doesn't need me to say that harmonically they are wonderful together.
Yeah,
it's just a big barrel of fun. I mean, so I suppose one could also highlight some of the perhaps more underrated songs, if any of the songs are underrated in Grease. I think it's "Look at Me, I'm Sandra Dee," which is Stockard Channing's song mainly as Rizzo, which is very funny. Just taking lumps out of the initially prudish Sandy character, and obviously the whole idea is that Sandy transforms by the end of the film, but then Danny transforms as well to an extent. So there's meant to be that balance with the characters in terms of how they've changed. I think this soundtrack has been well traversed enough, hasn't it? There probably isn't very much else we can add to it, really.
Yeah, but I think you've broken it down really well there, in that it is fun. It is a lot of fun. It does remind, I mean, for a particular generation, I think it will remind them a lot of, there'll be the people who it reminds them of high school, if they were particularly much older, it could be in the 50s, but there will be a lot of people who it reminds them of the 70s, and it reminds them of the 80s, when you had Grease, I think was 76 or something like that.
78 it was, apparently, yeah.
78,
yeah.
And then you had Grease 2, I think, follow like a little bit afterwards. Not that everyone's seen Grease 2, but so these films were late 70s, early 80s, sort of in that mindset, and so I think but it's carried through. You've had stage musicals, like we say, as cheesy as they are in club settings. At least they've kept the songs lingering around, and I think in that context that's quite good. It just proves how fun the songs are, even divorced of the film, in that you can dance to these things, and they're super popular. And maybe even more popular in Britain, weirdly. You know, it feels like, I don't know if they have the Grease Megamix and all that kind of thing in American clubs and things like that, but certainly it's been a British staple for years. So they are huge fun, and I think you can't really have a discussion about high school movies without talking about Grease, certainly in terms of the music. So
yeah, I mean, I suppose
it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, well, for me, there is a personal connection because I used to play the violin at school myself in the school orchestra, and we played Summer Nights. That was probably the first time I'd come across it. So I was like 12, 13. I hadn't seen Grease before then, and I was kind of like, it was actually really good fun to play. It's because it's so energetic. And doing Summer Nights with an orchestral ensemble is great fun. I mean, we did a lot of things. We did like Star Wars, we did Phantom of the Opera, but I always remember whenever they broke out Summer Nights for like end of term concerts or whatever, it was really good fun to do that. So I suppose there is a personal connection with me in that sense. I mean, I also wanted to point out the fact that the only song which got an Oscar nomination was Hopelessly Devoted to You.
Which is a good song.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, well, apparently it lost the Oscar to Donna Summer's Last Dance from Thank God It's Friday, which I can't say I've seen. I don't know if I know that.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that. That's a nice story about Summer Nights. Mine is far less classy because I have... the amount of time, Sean, about 1:30 in the morning that I have danced or sang quite drunkenly Summer Nights with a girl I've been attempting to pull on a night out. I can't even describe how many times that has happened and how many times I failed.
The problem with the Grease Megamix, because it was condensed, wasn't it? It's kind of, oh, right, we've only got a limited amount of time now before they throw it over to something else.
Exactly. Yeah. But they used to finish it with that, though. Quite often they would finish the Megamix with Summer Nights. Yeah. And... yeah, it's just so. I mean, I'm sure people who have, particularly in the UK, if anyone's in the UK and they've been out to a club in the last 20 years, will have done the Summer Nights end Megamix sort of sing song with somebody, and it's I vividly remember it. And you know, it's possible it may happen again. I don't really do clubs anymore. I've sort of done it now. Like the thought of going to a club now fills me with a level of dread. Yeah, quite honestly. Yeah. But it's not. I'm not saying never say never again. You know, another 80s staple. You know, it might happen again. Who knows?
They need to just create something for when we're the old farts, when we're like in our 40s and 50s. They just need to basically create a club that's basically walled off to anyone younger than that, and it's like put stuff on the walls that we're going to recognise, put the music on them. It's like anyone who's like 16, 17 can just bugger off. You're not going to get this.
Yeah, no, it's too old for you. I still remember the Peter Kay joke where he's talking about people who are young now, what they're going to be like in the early future. He's saying, put a bit of basement jacks on. Put a bit of basement jacks on for your dad.
Spot on. Absolutely spot on, yeah.
That's it, isn't it? I'm going to move forward slightly to the 80s for my next one, which is the Peter Gabriel song, In Your Eyes. In Your Eyes. For Say Anything, which is the 1989. So it's the tail end of the 80s. The film by Cameron Crowe, the first film by Cameron Crowe, who obviously would go on to sort of have a career filled with kind of romantic, sort of nostalgic sort of tales. But this is the famous John Cusack with the boombox, you know, above his head, Romeo and Juliet style, under the window of the girl he loves.
Yeah, I own a Sky, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. Booming out In Your Eyes in the boombox. The song that was playing for the first time they slept together. I feel like this is an example. It's not necessarily a song that is as well known as a Grease track or, you know, Simple Minds, that kind of thing. But it's a moment in cinema, or particularly in 80s cinema, that has sort of gone beyond the film. In that I think more people will have seen the moment of John Cusack and the boombox than they will have actually watched Say Anything, which is a pretty good film in itself. And I don't know if they would automatically remember the song. You know, Peter Gabriel's better known for things like Sledgehammer in the 80s. I love that song. Sledgehammer. That's a great song. I just love that. I
can have my own 80s megamix here. I'm recording all of these. I'm going to edit them together.
Good, perfect. Yeah, bonus material for our one listener. Well, after this podcast, there'll be one listener. But do you see what I mean? In that I don't think it's one of those songs necessarily or films that has been remembered by everybody to the degree some of the things we've talked about. But that moment is a very sort of signature high school movie moment from American cinema.
Yeah, definitely. It signals that all that teenage disillusionment, melancholia that teens go through, don't they? Particularly, in terms of romance and so on. I know I've been through that. And I suppose the important thing to say is that Cameron Crowe was a former Rolling Stone journalist. And like Quentin Tarantino, Cameron Crowe, when he's on top form, has got an eerily intuitive knack of knowing what song will work in what context. I mean, I think my favourite use of a pop song in any movie is Tiny Dancer from Crowe's Almost Famous, when they're on the bus. That is just magnificently well done. I love that scene to bits. But yeah, Say Anything. It's interesting, actually, given what I've just said about Crowe's intuitive knack of alighting on the right song for the right scene. There is an interesting story behind this. There's an Entertainment Weekly article about how Cameron Crowe was struggling to alight on the right song for the scene. Apparently, again, weird, he's popped up a few times on this podcast. Apparently, they were going to go with Billy Idol. Or they wanted to go with Billy Idol. But it didn't work out. And then apparently Cameron Crowe put on his wedding night mixtape
okay,
when he was in the car, and he heard this Peter Gabriel In Your Eyes, and he thought, that's it, that's the song. And they synced it up with the scene, which they'd already shot. It worked. They then had to get permission from Peter Gabriel to use it. Then there was that anxious wait. Is he going to approve it or not? Cameron Crowe was then called by Peter Gabriel going, well, I'm not really happy with the song being used in the overdose scene. And Cameron Crowe's like, hey, overdose scene? There's no overdose scene in the film. And it's kind of like, no, we're not. There's no overdose scene in the film. This is the high school movie where John Cusack wears the trench coat and carries the boombox. And Peter Gabriel was like, oh, sorry, I haven't watched that film yet. That's the other one that they're asking permission for. He apparently Peter Gabriel had watched another film for which they were seeking permission for this song, and he got it mixed up. and
Brilliant.
And Cameron Crowe was like, no, we're the other film. Please go and watch the other film. And then Peter Gabriel watched it, came back and went, yeah, more than happy, more than happy for you to use it, which I thought is wonderful. I hadn't read that story before. That's something I looked up, which is lovely. But yeah, it works. I mean, again, you talk about how tonality of songs is so important in communicating the emotional narrative of the characters. And as I said at the very beginning, that is an art form. To take somebody else's work and to apply it to your own film is really skilled. I think a lot of people might think that the art of creating a great soundtrack is just slapping on as many diverse songs as possible. It's not that at all. It's deeper than that.
It's interesting that it was a difficult choice, potentially to have what was coming out the boombox, because I suppose you've kind of got to try and get that right, haven't you? And it's sort of there's I suppose there's almost like a magical sort of alchemy to how these songs are chosen. In that some cases maybe it's just instinct. A lot of it's instinct, I think, but you just don't know, I suppose, until you put it all together whether that song particularly has worked in that moment. And I think in a lot in the case all of these cases, these songs do work. In their contexts. But it must be a gamble for each filmmaker when they're putting these things together. It's different when you have a score. When you have a score, you're working with that composer in sometimes to sort of craft the two things together. But I suppose if you're putting a film together quite often, and then you've got a moment which is going to have a pop song or a rock song or whatever on top of it, it's trial and error, I think, a little bit more, isn't it? Particularly if that song has been created for something else and isn't as... Maybe that's why Don't You Forget About Me works particularly well with The Breakfast Club, because it was kind of all came together at the same time. Yeah,
well, the creatives of The Breakfast Club, it was Keith Forsey, wasn't it? Actually, yeah, he knew that The Simple Minds would be perfect for the film. It was just a question of The Simple Minds being willing to do it, which ultimately they were. But yeah, I suppose when you're dealing with a song that wasn't specifically written for the film and you're retrospectively bolting it on to a movie, it's a huge gamble. It's funny, I was talking to someone the other day about Donnie Darko and how the theatrical cut of Donnie Darko begins with The Killing Moon, Echo and the Bunnymen, which works magnificently well. It creates that sense of dislocation and surreal fantasy really, really well. And then in the director's cut of Donnie Darko, it's not that song. They changed. I can't remember what they changed. I'm pretty sure they changed it in the opening scene, and it's kind of like, oh, and that's the director's cut, as in implying that maybe Echo and the Bunnymen, the Killing Moon, wasn't Richard Kelly's original choice for the theatrical one. It's like,
that's interesting.
It's interesting.
That's interesting. Yeah, it is, isn't it? Really, because it makes you wonder. Yeah, a lot where these decisions are made and that kind of thing. But yeah, it's it works. This one works well, and it's a really nice song anyway by Peter Gabriel. So yeah, it all comes together. We're going to go back for our last little journey into orchestral music here for your next choice, Sean, which is the main theme from Brian De Palma's Carrie, scored by Pino Donaggio.
We've talked a lot about how high school movies are kind of euphoric and melancholy. There's a mixture of that sadness and happiness and joy and light. Carrie very much is on the despairing end of it. It was taken from the Stephen King novel, which I haven't actually read. That's one of the Stephen King books I haven't read. Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? I think that the film is so famous that I kind of feel I've got the measure of the story from the film, although I really do need to go back and read the books. I like some of Stephen King's stuff, but yeah, so the idea of Sissy Spacek as young Carrie White, who is on the verge of adulthood and is hideously tormented and bullied by her classmates. She suffers a religious fanatic mother, played in ghastly, monstrous and brilliant form by Piper Laurie. Carrie is invited to the prom, and you know deep down that it's going to go wrong at some level. It initially looks like that there is going to be a kind of magical romantic moment, and then there's the bucket of pig's blood scene, which leads to the horrific prom massacre sequence here, all orchestrated in suitably like Grand Guignol operatic form by Brian De Palma, but also very emotive form by Brian De Palma. He's very, very sensitively attuned to the journey of that central character. I know Brian De Palma gets derided very often for being a kind of like empty-headed visual stylist who nicks all of Alfred Hitchcock's tricks without really getting any of the storytelling nice, but I think that's actually unfair. I think Carrie works. The reason why it works is because of Brian De Palma elicits that fabulous central performance from Sissy Spacek that is heartbreaking. Is genuine. It might be the saddest horror film ever made, if you can call it a straight up horror film. I suppose it is. And the score is very, very important. The score by Pino Donaggio is unashamedly lush and melancholy, and the main theme, the flute and string theme, is just very, very, it's very sad. It anticipates where the character is going before we've kind of got there with her. The idea of what does it mean to be ostracised and bullied, what does it mean when you're a teenager and you have a hideous parental figure who torments you and treats you like dirt in the way that Mrs. White does. The score is actually rather diverse. What it does quite often is it mixes the lush theme for Carrie with these stabby, like Bernard Herrmann-esque strings, which come out more during the build up to the prom massacre scene, and then obviously the finale with her mother. You get these jabby strings, so the score does a very good job of alternating between pleasing melodious tones and things that are very creepy, which I suppose mirrors Carrie's emotional journey. But then you have there are a couple of like pop disco tracks which haven't resonated all that well. It's kind of ooh, those are like 70s relics. I mean, Pino Donaggio wasn't the only person to do this. I mean, there's a lot of Jerry Goldsmith scores from the 70s that do that as well, like Logan's Run, where you go from this commanding orchestral might, all of a sudden it's kind of like, oh, hang on a minute, I need to like have a pair of leg warmers, I need to like grow my hair out. It's like, where did this music come from? Like, and then the scoring of the prom massacre scene, which is the most famous scene in the film, where you have everyone is basically slaughtered and then burned alive. That scene is very well scored, because what you have is this incredibly disturbing, like buzzy synth drone that's just going on underneath, and it's a very good way of how you score menace in a very understated manner. There's no need to make the music bigger than the scene. The horror of the scene kind of speaks for itself, and the music just embellishes it enough. It embellishes the dehumanizing effects of what it means when Carrie kills all of her teachers and, you know, most of the students. Yeah, it's a great score. Again, it shows that the scores for high school movies and for teenage movies can be cut and dried in a lot of different ways, I think.
Yeah, it's a great example of the versatility of it, isn't it? Because, you know, none of the other choices really we've gone for have been like Carrie, you know, which it is a horror film, but it has a lot of different things going on as well. But I mean, it definitely is horror. I mean, particularly that the classic final sequence.
Oh yeah,
at the prom, which is poor. You know, even today, that is it's really disturbing.
And the final reveal. I mean, I remember when I first watched Carrie, I must have been about probably like 14, 15. The final scene where Sue comes to her grave and the hand comes flying out. Those, oh my goodness me! I remember I don't remember jumping that hard before watching that scene in Carrie. And Pino Donaggio's score just gets the discombobulating horror of that sequence so well, and then it turns out it was a dream, and you glide back into the lush pastoral strains of Carrie's theme, which is very tear-jerking.
It's a very different kind of score to any of the, you know, the other two particularly orchestral ones we've had on this podcast, and it's a great example of how high school movies don't have to be one thing, and I think that it's proven in this conversation that they're definitely not, that they all alternate between all kinds of different styles. It's a fantastic film, and it's a really good score as well for it. So for my last choice, I'm going for, I suppose, a track which is it's "Are You Man Enough" by the Four Tops for Superbad, the 2007 film starring Michael Cera and Jonah Hill, the film that kind of made those two really in many ways. Much as Sarah had already done, like Arrested Development and everything, this was the film that sort of put those two really on the map, so as film stars anyway. And I suppose "Are You Man Enough" isn't like as synonymous with that film as you have, like, you know, Simple Minds, you know, some of these other tracks that we've had, you know, the Grease songs and Danke and that kind of thing. But I think it sort of fits in terms of the sort of style that Superbad has. I mean, the song itself was originally on the soundtrack to Shaft in Africa, because it's from 1973, so it goes back a little bit of a way, and it's a proper sort of Motowny kind of, typically sort of uplifting sort of Four Tops track. But I think it fits Superbad because Superbad, I mean, the title of Superbad itself is a riff on those kind of, to some extent, those blaxploitation kind of movies, but also the whole film is about two guys who are painfully uncool trying to be cool, essentially. You know, two best friends who are, I mean, I think Superbad is one of the signature high school movies of the 2000s. You know, came out in 2007. And I watched this when I was nearly 30. Well, no, 25. Doing myself
scale down a bit. Scale down
a bit. So when I was 25, so I'm well past, you know, high school, but at the same time, I still find it very funny, even if it might now feel a little bit crass in places, and it was a bit crass then, I suppose. But I just think that a song like "Are You Man Enough" gets to the core of these two guys who are in a situation where they are desperately trying to hook up with girls and do all these, you know, typical high school things, and they're just not doing it very well. And I think if you contrast that with a very sort of cool, swaggering song from an earlier era, and you get a little bit more of that in Superbad, I think it just heightens the comedy in many ways. And I think that's sort of the essence of a song like this.
Yeah, I think the bravado of the music plays up the idiocy of the characters, isn't it? It's an ironic, like, distancing device, which is okay. I can tell, as a viewer, I can tell that the swagger of the song is deliberately matching up with what the characters think they're like, but it's not like that. I haven't seen Superbad for such a long time. I remember it's a movie that's very enamoured of its own vulgarity. I think there is a self-satisfied air to it, as there is with a lot of Judd Apatow. But that said, it is very funny. It's very funny, with caveats, I think, from me. I think that it's probably more authentic to the teenage boy experience than many people would like to admit. I mean, they are frequently vile. And the movie doesn't pretend that they're heroic in any way at all. And I think if the movie did pretend they were heroic, it would be an insufferable, horrible piece of trash. They are idiots, and I think that the movie unashamedly portrays them as idiots. But, you know, even idiots can go on their own journey towards self-discovery, which is what happens at the end. I always forget Emma Stone is in this film. Emma Stone, who plays the girl that Jonah Hill likes.
But it was sort of the film that put her on the map as well, wasn't it?
Yeah.
First time I think Emma Stone had really... Everyone went, oh, wow. And then you had Easy A soon after that, where she really stood out. And that's a fantastic film. That could have gone on this list, actually, Easy A, because that's brilliant.
It could have done. I'm kicking myself now that they didn't do Easy A. Yeah, obviously Zombieland as well that she did. Yeah, I mean, in the end, the ball is in the court of the girls, because Emma Stone's character is so far ahead of these relatively Neanderthal boys that she's more composed in and of herself. She's seemingly more assured about herself. And there is that build towards the end where there is that apology scene because Jonah Hill's character ends up accidentally headbutting her in the face because there's all that stuff that happens at the end, and they are kind of forced to sort of do that grovelling apology, but there is that genuine sense of connection between the characters, and I think the music humorously plays that up very, very well. And I mean, the music during the scenes where they have to do the whole fake ID things, that's very, very, very funny. That's just, I mean, I think everyone's been, even if you didn't create your own fake ID, I mean, I never did that at school, but I know people that did. But the whole anxiety about ID generally, about buying alcohol is, I think, a very relatable thing, and I think Superbad plays that up very well. I think it reflects it in the music very well. The whole,
I think so. I think. I mean, I remember I got a fake ID from. I used to because it was the 90s, and this is what we did. I used to buy FHM back in the day for the articles, of course. But at the back of that, you used to have you could write off and get a fake ID through the post. I mean, God knows how they got away with that.
You could apply for a fake ID through the post. That's insane.
Yeah. I know. There were these companies who would advertise, and you could write off, and you'd get a fake ID sent through. All you had to do was send them a photo, and I did it when I was like 16 or whatever. Did it work getting me into a club? Did it? It was just like it didn't. Because it was clearly fake. I mean, that's the thing. You couldn't get it past a bouncer, and ultimately, it's still true of clubs today. Bouncers are. If you're a cool dude and you're 16 and you look a bit older, they'll probably let you in. To be fair, right? If you're the kind of teenager I was, right, who didn't look cool and was clearly spotty and oiky enough to not be old enough, I ain't got a chance. So yeah, they were. But that whole quest of trying to be grown up by trying to do all these things, drink, and I suppose it's a bigger thing in the States because obviously the laws about drinking, you have to be older to buy alcohol in the States and things like that than we were as kids. But it's the same kind of things applied, and I think that's where that sort of crossover between the American high school experience and the British one, or particularly the American high school experience influencing British kids. Superbad's a good example of that, but in a different age to something like American Pie. It sort of takes the whole ideas of American Pie and play. And I mean, it's more in a way, it's more vulgar, like you said, than American Pie. American Pie was a little bit. Some of the aspects of it are problematic, but it wasn't as vulgar as Superbad. But then at the same time, they ultimately are. You mentioned the Emma Stone character. They have these girls in there, these women who are far more mature and intelligent than the lads. And that the films ultimately are designed to show up how stupid these young boys are, even if at the same time it favours them at the end because it suggests that they're going to be okay. They're not too bad, really. So it does favour the boys ultimately, when in reality not all teenagers learn lessons. But that, like you say, that quest is there. That quest to sort of do these things that they're not supposed to do, and that's why I found Superbad very funny, as vulgar as it is. I'd be interested. I haven't seen it in a long time. It would be interesting to see if I still find it as funny when I'm nearly 40.
I think that's the critical thing, isn't it? I think some films work when you watch them as teenagers, young adults, and then you come back to them about 10 years later. It's like, ugh. Like, it's like a bit. I wonder if Superbad would be like that. Can I just say on the whole ID thing? I struggled with that well into my 20s because I still look. I mean, I had to grow a beard. Basically, the reason why I grew a beard was to get around I'm really fed up of being ID'd into my 20s in clubs and bars, and then as soon as I grew the beard out, it was fine. But
you were all right. Amazing, isn't it?
Take the beard off. I must lose about 5 to 10 years, and it creates a problem. So yeah, it's like.
Whereas now, like, I wouldn't, if I was you, I wouldn't grow a beard now. I'd want to be, bring
go
it
back
on.
The other way.
Like,
I've got that option now. I can basically shave the ears off and just roll back the clock. Yeah.
I want to be ID'd now. Like, I'd love it. If they said, have you got ID? I'd be like, no, but I'm so glad you've asked.
Badge of honour.
Yeah. Exactly. Because now, if anything, I'd be like, have you seen the grey in my hair, mate? Like, come on. But yeah, Super. I will look at Superbad again one day and see if I still find it funny. But your last choice is definitely from a film which is funny, and I think will continue to be funny for a long, long time. You've gone for Oh Baby, which featured on the soundtrack to Booksmart.
Yeah, so Booksmart, we mentioned at the very start of this podcast the idea of the comedies that favoured well written women characters as a reaction to all the blokey laddie things like Superbad, actually, which was so prevalent, in the late noughties. And then, as I said, you got things like Bridesmaids, and then Booksmart came along, directed by Olivia Wilde in her feature film debut. Olivia Wilde doing a fantastic job behind the camera. This is a really
absolutely
it's great, isn't it? It's really
I love this film.
It's so funny. It's so inventive and surreal. Again, what it does is at the centre of it, Beanie Feldstein and Caitlin Dever are the geeky academics who want to prove that they can party as hard as the alleged like cool kids, and through the course of that journey they learn about themselves and about each other, and they learn what it means. Like, what you learn in a book doesn't necessarily apply to the practicalities of the real world. They're about to go their separate ways. Caitlin Dever's character is about to go and do charity work in Africa, and there is this growing tension between the two characters. But the journey is kind of like an After Hours thing, the Martin Scorsese After Hours thing, which is that the film is largely set at night, and you've got an escalating sort of chaotic odyssey in which more and more weird things start happening. There is a moment where they get their teacher doubles up as a taxi driver, and they end up streaming porn on a mobile device, and then he puts the Bluetooth on and then ends up playing the sound of it in the car. There are a lot of surreal moments like that which do have that kind of escalating chaos of After Hours, but what you do have as well is the emotional truth of these characters are on diverging paths, and you have that poignant melancholy sense of after this night nothing's going to be the same again in terms of where the characters stands with each other. And I think the music gets that really well. Again, I mentioned a good soundtrack will have really good narrative flow to it, and the start of the album will begin with a certain kind of tone, and then the end of the album will end with a different register. And you want to get a sense, even if you're not watching the film, you want to get a sense listening to that album on its own terms, I've been taken on the journey of the characters. And I think Olivia Wilde does that brilliantly with this. The track that I chose was, as you said, "Oh Baby" by LCD Soundsystem, which is from their 2017 American Dreams album, which is apparently their first album in 7 years. This is probably a scene that a lot of people might overlook, but it's the scene where Beanie Feldstein's character Molly has had an argument with Caitlin Dever's character. They've kind of split up in the evening. They're both looking to get back home in various ways. And then Molly is picked up by a character called Annabelle, aka Triple A, played by Molly Gordon, who she has an allegedly promiscuous reputation. Like, that's why she's called Triple A. It's to do with her alleged promiscuity. And then Triple A picks up Molly and they drive, and this track is playing in the background, and it's got this kind of, I've used this word repeatedly, melancholy, slightly plaintive tone to it, which works brilliantly in the scene because the two characters learn about each other. Molly learns that the people slap high school names on each other, which are often very malicious and very nasty and not well earned at all. And it's the process of her learning about AAA, Annabelle, and the music ties into the scene so well. There's this kind of like awakening realization tone through the music. It's a fantastic song anyway. I really like LCD Soundsystem, I suppose. They're famous for the likes of Daft Punk is Playing at My House, which I remember being a big hit when I was at school going into university, so like 2005 to 2008 period. And it's an example of a song that works, but all of the songs have the soundtrack begins with that kind of brash air of bravado. So you've got like Salt and Pepper and DJ Shadow, and then it moves. Those are two examples early on in the album. Then it moves into this more kind of reflective, wistful tone with the likes of LCD Soundsystem, and then there's bits of Beethoven thrown in there as well. Really, really diverse soundtrack for a very funny yet very truthful film. I think it's across the board it works.
Yeah, it does. There's a lot of different shades to the Booksmart soundtrack, and I went and listened to the majority of it actually, and I picked up some cracking sort of. I've realised I like a sort of fusion between sort of jazzy, Motowny kind of pop and R&B, and there's quite a bit of that on this at various points. So I picked up a few tunes I hadn't heard. I was like, oh, I like that. That's going into my awesome mix because I've got one. Because I'm a sad act and I've got one of them like Peter Quill. Like I've got awesome mix volumes X, Y, and Z. But it's great. It's really diverse, and it works really well in context of what is already a really well written film, really well directed, brilliantly acted by those two. But the music does add something to this, absolutely. And I think that's why, I mean, I'd like to think Booksmart is going to go down as one of the great high school movies, actually. I hope it sort of helps to define this last decade in terms of that, in a way that things like The Breakfast Club did in the 80s, or even things like Empire Records maybe did, or Clueless in the 90s. You know, and the fact it does it from this particularly feminine standpoint where, you know, in a far more, I mean, much as I quite like Bridesmaids and those kind of films, this doesn't have to me, this has a little bit more emotion to it and a little bit more going on in terms of really tapping into that teenage uncertainty and angst while being brilliantly funny at the same time. And so just nice, and there's just so much goodness about Booksmart. It is a film that I would say is a great definer for the teenage experience in the modern day, and I would encourage anyone, if they haven't seen Booksmart, to go and check it out because it's so good. So I hope it can sit in that pantheon. And I suspect it will, Sean, to be honest. Yeah, definitely. I absolutely think it will. Yeah. Can I just say, to go back to an earlier point when I was talking about the Donnie Darko director's cut, about I wasn't sure what Echo and the Bunnymen had been switched with. It was switched with Never Tear Us Apart by INXS. How do you pronounce it? Cool.
In
excess,
yeah.
Michael Hutchence,
and that was the song that replaced The Killing Moon on the director's cut of Donnie Darko, and it doesn't work anything like as well as the Echo and the Bunnymen tracks. It kind of makes you suspect Richard Kelly's choices. It's like, was that? Yeah. So maybe that was maybe Echo and the Bunnymen was a choice imposed by the studio, maybe because of licensing fees. But
maybe
why would he change it to something worse? And one has to suspect is maybe his intuition and his skills there. But you mentioned the Peter Kay Basement Jacks thing. Basement Jacks were used during the end credits of Tomb Raider, Lara Croft Tomb Raider with Angelina Jolie. So I'm like, it's kind of like when Basement Jacks is cited as a kind of like old school thing, which it might already be now. It's kind of like, that's going to be me.
Yeah. It's like, wow, we're that old now. Yeah. Hopefully this podcast has proven how crucial a good song is sometimes to some of these great films. And hopefully you'll go away and you'll enjoy listening to our playlist. And we'll put it in the show notes. And we'll have 10, maybe a couple more songs on there for you to enjoy, and hopefully listen either with listening to the podcast or afterwards or before, or however you want to do it. But yeah, do go away and listen to that because that'll be a lot of fun. We'll also put Sean's interview with Michael Giacchino in there as well for you to have a little read, and hopefully you'll enjoy those little additions. But thanks for joining us for another episode. And remember, we're part of the We Made This podcast network. And the music of high school movies is not all we're going to be discussing on that network, so we'll give you a taste of what else you might have missed in a minute. We'll be back soon, won't we? I think we're going to go back into orchestral territory next time, aren't we, Sean? I think we might be doing Elmer Bernstein.
Yeah, for me, one of the godfathers of film music is old Elmer, and we saw his music being performed live at the Royal Albert Hall, which was magical.
About 3 or 4 years ago, something like that now, I think.
Believe it was, yeah, and John Landis introduced Ferris because John Landis worked with him. John Landis was like the compere. Brilliant evening. Great,
that. We'll talk a bit about that, I dare say. We thought we'd flash back and do as we still wait, for cinemas to open, for new scores, all this kind of thing, to really bounce back. We're going to go back and look at some Elmer Bernstein. So we think that will be the next episode, probably. Unless something happens, unless something changes the plan, but we'll see. Until then, anyway, we hope you enjoy the music we've discussed, that you stay safe and well, and we'll see you next time as we discuss the music of film Between the Notes. Elsewhere on We Made This. Pull or pass?
Across these films, obviously, Spider-Man in the comics, he created his own web fluid and had, wrist-mounted mechanics. He actually has that as part of his body in this. So every time he's swinging, it's mucus or snot or spit.
Yeah, it's a nice little touch. Again, I think from memory, that's from the Ultimate line as well.
Is it from the Ultimate?
Yeah, literally, it drips.
It feels like that's what it should have been in the comics.
It wasn't. Everything happened in the Ultimate Spider-Man.
The giddy carousel of pop.
Skipping through a few pages and we get to a 2-page feature is Bluey Sum, the 2-hit wonder.
Can you imagine what incredibly tedious company he must be? So, watch out, Bluey's about. Hilariously throws his female press officer in the swimming pool twice. Oh, how she must have laughed. So, I just really took a dislike to this guy. And especially with the way he signs off with, I'm a decadent rock and roller. You just get you straight down the dumper now, you.
Frame to frame.
The essential magic is, the principle is exactly the same. The projected images is the essence of it, no matter what kind of form the individual films themselves takes. It's the idea of making peace with the past while also not being bound by it, I think is moving.
It's a massive love letter to cinema as a whole as well, isn't it? It's looking back at some of the historic films and films that have been before, and it is just a love letter. It's looking back through those rose-tinted glasses.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network. Between the Notes is produced and edited by Tony Black, who hosts alongside Sean Wilson. You can find Tony on Twitter at AJBlackWriter and Sean on Twitter at Seano22. You can find Between the Notes on Twitter at BTW_notes, on iTunes, your podcast app of choice, on Spotify, Stitcher and on Spreaker, where the show is part of the We Made This podcast network. For more podcasts all about TV, film, books, music and popular culture in general, you can find We Made This on Facebook and on Twitter at We Made This Pod. Thanks for listening.